The EU and Great Britain are trying to put their relationship on a new footing with an agreement after Brexit. The fishing rights are economically insignificant, but they have a high emotional value. Both sides are following a hard line there. In the last few weeks, even Michel Barnier, that old French school diplomat, sounded more and more impatient. Time is running out. That is one of his standard sentences after each new round of negotiations that has again brought no progress. Negotiators from Brussels and London have been meeting regularly since March to negotiate a partnership agreement that will regulate relations between the two sides after the end of the Brexit transition period at the end of the year. So far, without any success. And so, as Michel Barnier notes grumpily, it cannot go on forever. In the fisheries sector too, the negotiations are deadlocked. A symbolic topic for both sides. To understand that, one only has to watch the news as Boris Johnson rushes into the northern English fishing port of Grimsby to have a huge cod hugged in front of the cameras. Or one has to remember how British and French trawlers ram each other on the high seas to battle for scallops. The objectives of both sides could not be more different. Basically, the EU wants everything to stay the way it is. In any case, an agreement that leads to the destruction of part of the EU fishing industry will not be accepted, said Chief Negotiator Barnier. Currently, the principle applies that fishermen from any EU member state are allowed to fish in the territorial waters of all other EU states. However, under strict rules that are hidden behind the terms TAC and quote, every year in December, the EU fisheries ministers negotiate the so-called TAC, the total allowable catches. These are maximum catches for all fish species in the various European sea areas. Once these maximum quantities have been agreed to ensure that there is no overfishing, then they are distributed to the individual member states, according to a key that has remained unchanged for many years. This ensures a certain degree of economic predictability for the fishermen. British fishermen, however, feel that the system has long been disadvantaged. And as the UK in a Changing Europe shows, where I got these texts from this time, they are linked in my description, by the way, either their homepage or their YouTube channel. Trawlers from France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Denmark and Spain brought in more fish from British waters than the British themselves, they say. The British fish should belong to the British fishermen. This is the slogan with which they supported Brexit. In doing so, however, they overlook one thing. The British government is responsible for distributing the fishing quotas negotiated in Brussels in their own country. And that allowed a concentration that doesn't exist in the EU. A large part of the fishing rights belong to only a few entrepreneurs. And a large number of other British fishermen have to be content with the remaining quota, which increases their dissatisfaction. In order to secure the support of these dissatisfied people, the British government is therefore playing the sovereignty card. Our fishing grounds are our resource, said Brexit Minister Michael Gove in the House of Commons, and he added, only we set the rules by which others are allowed to fish in our waters. The British negotiating position revolves around the concept of so-called zonal attachment. This gives the fish stocks a citizenship. Specifically, the fishermen in a country are given preferential treatment when allocating the fishing quotas for their own waters. Or to put it another way, British fish for British fishermen, primarily at least. But above all, the British want to renegotiate the quotas year after year, as Prime Minister Boris Johnson has made clear. With such an agreement, there would be annual negotiations with the EU based on the latest scientific findings. This would ensure that British fishing grounds are there for British boats first and foremost. The result would be that the fishermen from France, Belgium and the other EU countries would permanently have the sword of Damocles hang over their career. The countries concerned reject this strictly. When Michel Barnier recently sounded out in the EU whether he could be a little more flexible in the fisheries negotiations, the national ministers unceremoniously whistled him back. The other side also believes that it is now important to stay tough in order to get as much out of it as possible. Mike Park knows Scottish fishing like no other. For more than 30 years he has pulled the fish from the North Sea himself off the local coasts, mostly with his own trawlers. Later he switched to politics. As managing director of the White Fish Association, he represents the interests of 260 fishermen who mainly catch cod, haddock and saithe, but also plaice, Norway lobster and mussels. After Brexit, Mike Park is convinced Scottish fishermen will finally be able to catch up with Norway and Iceland. Of Norway and Iceland, fishermen can use 65 to 90% of their stocks, while we Scottish fishermen can only catch around 40% here. After Brexit, we as a sovereign state want to have the opportunity to get the majority of the fish out of our waters ourselves. So, a supposedly bright future for the British and Scottish fisheries after Brexit? This would be significantly at the expense of other nations, which together so far are allowed to take home more than half of the catches from British waters. The fisheries biologist Gerd Kraus explains why German fishermen in particular could lose a lot after Brexit. Yes, a lot actually. So the German deep sea fishing is not particularly large, but it is very efficient and lucrative fishery. 8% of herring catches in the North Sea are in UK waters, and 60% of mackerel catches are in the waters. And so these are really dimensions that fishermen in other regions can no longer compensate for. Gerd Kraus heads the Thünen Institute for Sea Fisheries in Bremerhaven. There, the fisheries economist Ralf Döring deals with various scenarios that could follow after Brexit. When you see the negotiations, you have to expect that there will be no contract as of January 1st, so no fishing contract. And that would mean that German fisheries or EU fishermen are no longer allowed to fish in British waters. In the long run, business won't get any easier anyway. The Chinese, Koreans and Russians fish on the world's oceans. Especially in the fish-rich North Atlantic, the interests of large fishing nations collide, which are difficult to reconcile, says Peter Breckling, Secretary General of the German Fisheries Association in Hamburg. It's all part of complex international agreements and negotiations. And in the North Atlantic, with the so-called coastal states, Iceland, Greenland, Norway, Faroe Islands, there's always a complicated balanced quota distribution system, and you have to see where you can find alternatives. There's absolutely no way of saying, yes, then I will use a few thousand tons more halibut of Greenland than I have lost here. That is definitely not possible. That is why the fish-rich grounds around Scotland remain so important for German fishermen. And the British, as Mike Park emphasizes, do not want to shut out their colleagues from Germany, the European Union and Norway either. It would be neither economically nor politically sensible to completely ban other fishing nations. But we are striving to significantly reduce the quantities that fishermen from the EU and certainly from Norway are still allowed to catch here in the future. At present, EU cutters catch around 3 times as much fish in British waters as, conversely, British cutters in the seas areas of the European Union. The British were never able to get used to this magnitude, nor with the principle of relative stability negotiated in the early 1980s. According to this, every catching nation is entitled to a historically determined quota. The cake is sometimes bigger and sometimes smaller, but you always have the same percentage of fishing rights. Peter Breckling from the German Fisheries Association sees good reasons for sticking to this principle of traditional fishing quotas. The catches are variable anyway because the size of the fish stocks naturally fluctuates from year to year. The relative stability was negotiated at the time on the basis of historical records, that is, catch records of the vehicles with certain flags on the back. So from the origin of a state and not from the place of catch. If a German vessel fished cod off the Scottish coast, it was then counted as a German catch and as a German quota in order to bring stability to the historically developed traditional fishing activity. Brussels wants to stick to this tradition also in British waters even after Brexit. For the British, however, this politically motivated distribution pattern is anathema. As already mentioned, they insist on being able to catch a larger part of the fish in their marine areas themselves after Brexit. This is where the zonal attachments come into play. Basically, the zonal link is based on the amount of fish in national waters. It takes into account where the fish swim, where they spawn, where they grow up, and where they are ultimately caught. Unfortunately, from the EU's point of view, many species such as cod, haddock, scythe, and whiting spend most of their life cycle in Scottish waters. However, it is difficult to assign a herd to a specific territory. Most fish migrate over hundreds, sometimes even thousands of nautical miles in the course of their life, naturally also across sea borders from one sovereign territory to another. Then who does the catch really belong to if the fish are constantly moving in the course of a fish's life? That is exactly the question. Fish are spread over long stretches and usually also have specific growth areas, spawning areas, feeding areas. And with herring, it is the case that the growing areas are to be found particularly in the German Bight and off the Jutland coast. And then, when they get bigger, they will drift northwards and then migrate back to the English coast to spawn at some point. There they are caught, but if we catch the juvenile fish, for example in the spread fishery, then we could certainly use a lever, but we'd rather not imagine that at all. The other question is, would the British even have enough cutters and trawlers to be able to catch the fish themselves in extreme cases? Ralf Döring from the Thünen Institute in Bremerhaven says yes, but it is assumed that the vehicles are not being used to capacity even with herring or mackerel, in the sense that they could fish more, but they have no processing capacity for it. You would have to sell the fish more or less immediately. It looks similar with other species. That would not change significantly even if the catch quotas were changed. That means a larger proportion of haddock or cod, for example. The British already had to export most of their fresh fish in the EU because the domestic market was not big enough. To this day, they still import canned food from Germany, for example. There are hardly any processing companies on the island and therefore no significant added value. This gap will widen even further after Brexit. Significantly more fresh fish, but then still no capacity to progress the goods. Mike Park fully recognizes this dilemma and sees his country facing major challenges. It is obvious that we have to invest a lot on our coast. But exports must also be pushed further. We must open up new trade routes, possibly to Germany as well. I don't know exactly how much herring our fishermen are already exporting to Germany so far. The herring has been caught here by the German fleet. But the demand for herring in Germany will continue to exist, and let's take a look at where you will get it delivered in the future. For example, a fish canning factory near Sassnitz on Rügen, one of the largest in Europe, has also processed a lot of herring and mackerel from Scottish waters in recent years. If this supply were to be eliminated now, that would be a problem. Conversely, in the opinion of Ralf Döring from the Thünen Institute in Bremerhaven, the British should ask themselves the question, what should they do with the perishable fish if the EU should close its borders? The EU market is of course big. There's of course one of the major importers in the world, and if you are cut off from it, more or less, then it will not be so easy to sell the fish anywhere else. Very unlikely that you will be able to open up new markets there in the short term. From the point of view of Peter Breckling from the German Fisheries Association, Michel Barnier should also use this lever in his negotiations in Brussels. Without access to British waters as before, no imports of British fish. The British want to continue to sell most of their catches to the EU. They want to be able to continue doing this duty-free and unlimited, even larger quantities as before. But they demand that we suffer an economic disadvantage because we can catch less. If the negotiating partner demands that, he can in principle keep everything he has had. Unlimited, duty-free market access, and then demands of the other party. So you have to cut corners, accept losses and so on. That is a principle that the EU cannot accept under any circumstances. Mike Park, however, sees the Scottish fishermen well positioned in the future. He believes that the EU's internal market will remain open for British fish. At most, from his point of view, tariffs will be levied. Once the tariffs have been set, we can use them to calculate. We need security on this issue. But in the end, it is crucial for us to regain control of our own waters for the benefit of the UK fishing fleets. Poker will continue in Brussels. Peter Breckling remains calm in Hamburg. The German fishing companies have already prepared for different scenarios after Brexit, he says. What that means in concrete terms, but he doesn't want to reveal. It is still too early for that. December 31st, 2020 is not the end of all days for us, even in relation to the British. There will then be no access for us and no import of British catches. And then we assume that a level of suffering will develop that will also lead the decision makers to set something up. It should actually be possible to bridge the differences between Brussels and London. The truth is that the fishing industry on both sides of the English Channel is intimately linked. The fishermen on the continental side of the canal are vitally dependent on access to British waters. For example, 60% of the catches landed in Belgian North Sea ports come from British waters. And on the other hand, the dependency is no less. 75% of the fish that British trawlers pull out of the water is for export. Most of it ends up in the EU. In France, fishermen are already mobilizing in the event the negotiations fail. Like this fisherman, they announce blockades. If we go to war, it is clear that the British are losing on European markets. In any case, they will no longer be able to sell their fishery products in France. The EU intends to address that issue of fishing quotas for European fishermen in UK waters under the Agreement on Future Trade Relations. That means without catch quotas, no fish can be exported to the EU. However, London firmly rejects this link, so both sides seem to be on a confrontational course, if it weren't for the bare numbers. Because measured against what is economically at stake if there is no agreement on trade in industrial goods and services, the economic importance of the fishing industry is marginal. No matter how important it is symbolically, it is hard to imagine that the future of European-British trade relations should depend on the subordinate economic sector. And if you now want to know more about European politics, YouTube has chosen another of my videos right here for you in the end screen, right next to your chance to subscribe to my channel, which I hope you already did. But if you haven't and you will do it now, please don't forget to click the little bell so you'll be notified when I publish another video. I'll see you in my next video. Click and enjoy. Viel Spaß!